got the industry equilibrium, we can see for this particular product the optimal level of output for the whole industry and the optimal price. So the price is set at the industry level and is then taken by the individual firm. So that's very different to the scenario in monopoly where the monopolist is a price setter. So the small firm producing the homogeneous good, competing with many rivals, takes the price set by the industry. What it's facing is a horizontal demand curve. So this is the individual firm's demand curve. Essentially what it means is that there is infinite demand for this small firm's good or service. And the only limit to what it's going to produce is going to be determined by the intersection of the demand function with the cost function. But before we come to add in the marginal cost curve, we need to think about what else is represented by a horizontal demand curve. So our elasticity of demand is infinite. But this is very different to the downward sloping demand curve which is faced by the monopolist. Remember, the monopolist has a downward sloping demand curve and a steeper downward sloping marginal revenue function. What that is telling us is that each increase in output, each expansion requires a price reduction. So the price reduction to sell the marginal unit means that marginal revenue is declining. So greater output means this sacrifice in the per unit price that is available. When you have a horizontal demand curve, your revenue from each unit is going to be the same. So you don't have to cut the price in order to sell more units. So essentially what this means is the horizontal demand function is also the average revenue and marginal revenue curve. To indicate that it's a small firm, I've indicated that the demand function with a low d, similarly to a low q, indicating quantity produced by the small firm. So our final step then, if this is marginal revenue, we need to add in the marginal cost function, a typical tick shape as before. So here we find Q star, the optimal level of output for this individual small producer in a given industry. Marginal cost was equal to marginal revenue. So this is the optimal level of output at which their costs are covered, their opportunity costs are covered, but there is no opportunity for abnormal profit. So the last thing we need to add in will be the average cost function. So we've added in the average cost function to show that this is the equilibrium position for this small firm. Remember, the average cost function cuts the marginal cost function at its lowest point. This is equilibrium for a small firm. The last thing to think about with this diagram is just to refresh your memory about the concept of welfare. So remember the fact that we could take the industry diagram and alter the labels for this in order to represent welfare maximisation at the level of the economy. So our supply curve became our social marginal cost and our demand curve became our social marginal benefit. Where these two intersect reflects the optimal price and quantity for a given economy. If we're at that point, we should be maximising welfare and not losing any potential welfare in the shape of deadweight loss. So this is the nirvana point, if you like, in economic terms. At this point, it's worth just reminding ourselves what's encapsulated in the demand curve and the supply curve. So remember, the demand curve is a locus of price and quantity combinations which are faced in a given market if we hold everything else constant. So we need to remind ourselves of some of the things that are held constant in order to generate this demand curve, to remind ourselves why we don't face equilibrium on a regular basis. So price and quantity combinations indicating demand for this good if we hold income constant, if we hold demographics constant, if we hold cultural change constant. Now obviously it's impossible to hold all of those things constant, which is why we can't represent particular economic sectors in such a simplistic way. Similarly, supply is indicating what producers of the good or service are willing to produce, reflecting their costs. So what are they willing to accept to produce that good or service? And we're holding constant here factors which might affect the cost of their inputs, but we're also holding constant significant things like climate change in the case of agricultural products. We're holding constant technology, which would improve the capacity either of labour, by which I mean training, or rapid technological change and innovation in terms of, say, robotics, which make manufacturing, production, and even pharmaceuticals and apparently soon services much more productive. So this would have a fundamental effect on the supply curve, and that of course means that both supply and demand are constantly changing, so we get constant change in the economy. So that's perfect competition. We'll turn next to monopolistic competition.